Ladies and gentlemen, people in our virtual audience, welcome back to, at least here in the room, the most important session of the day, lunch. We've decided we wanted to speak while you're at lunch so that you don't fall asleep during Mike's very good presentation, as exciting as he's going to be. But honestly, you're in for a real treat today. Dr. Mike Howard is the CEO Emeritus of the Electric Power Research Institute, the guys who basically are trying to help the world electrify, one of the most important parts of energy transition. He is currently the chair of the World Energy Council and has more than 40 years of experience in all parts of energy operations, finance, sales and marketing, product development, strategic planning. And was elected by the United States Energy Association in 2019 to get the United States Energy Award for his energy leadership and contributions to international understanding of energy issues. He's got a BS from University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He's got an MS from the University of Pittsburgh and a PhD in engineering science, again from University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And we're going to try and do this as informally as we can. I'm going to give Mike a few minutes to start off. I'm going to have a couple of leading questions, but we want to draw all of you into the conversation. The discussion has been so good this morning. I want to make sure that when you agree with something, you let us know. If you disagree with something Mike says, that you also let us know and have a real dialogue started. So, Mike, it's a pleasure to have you here in Washington with us today. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I tell you, the discussions this morning were fantastic. That is exactly why I really enjoy coming to these types of events, because as you said, I've been in the energy space for a long time. Most of my work in the energy space has been really focused on electricity. And every time I come to something like this, I learn something. And so I really want to have a discussion here. I don't want to have a formal presentation or anything, but really wanted to engage with you and talk about also a lot of the discussions that we talked about this morning. Excellent questions that were brought up, excellent comments, and so I really want to have that kind of a free-flowing discussion as well. But so as the ambassador said, I started my career back in 1980. I started with Westinghouse and spent about 10 years there, started my own company, sold it, and then got involved with EPRI. And EPRI is one of the largest collaborative applied research energy electricity organization in the world. It does pretty close to about $500 million of work. It's a global organization. Its headquarters is in Palo Alto, California, on the Stanford campus. So I finished my career there a couple of years ago. For 10 years, was the CEO at EPRI. And EPRI gets involved in all kinds of energy-related things, primarily electricity, from nuclear to fossil to renewable energy to transmission, distribution, batteries, electric vehicles, electrification, on and on. So it covers a wide breadth of various energy-related topics. And then I was on the World Energy Council board and became chair about almost a year ago. And so how many of you are familiar with the World Energy Council? Okay. It actually started 100 years ago, right after World War I, to create a forum to have a dialogue about energy, very much similar to what we're doing here, but to bring all the people around the world, not discourage one view or another, but have a robust, more intellectual, fact-based discussion about how can we move forward with energy for humanity without shooting each other. That was really the reason it started, and it's been going forward since then. Every 3 years, although now we're going to every 2 years, we have a major conference. We call it a Congress, World Energy Congress. Right before COVID, it was in Abu Dhabi. And we'll have 15,000 people from there around the world in a series of 4 or 5 days sessions talking about many of the things we're talking about here. The next one is in Rotterdam. It's April of this coming year, and so we'll do the same thing. So please look at the World Energy Council on the website, sign up, be there in Rotterdam. I think it's going to be one of the most interesting weeks to really have a robust discussion about energy and the topics we talked about. So that's kind of a commercial for that. And for EPRI, go to the website, look at it. It's called epri.com. There's a lot of good, useful information on the website that if you're interested in certainly about electricity, you can download it, look at it, and some of them are a little more techy, but go there and take a look at it. So let me just a couple of comments on the whole energy transition. You know, throughout history, go back a couple of thousand years ago, we've been through actually many energy transitions. The one that is probably the largest was the energy transition moving from more plant-based tree animal resources to coal, and that mostly started around the early 1800s. And before then, the use of energy was really based on just what we could physically do. What could we do with using animals, a horse maybe, to plow a field? And so our use of energy was extremely limited. But when we figured out how to boil water to produce steam, to push a piston, boy, that really changed a lot of things. And that occurred in the early 1800s. What did that do, though? What was the one thing that it allowed us to do? It significantly, almost by an order of 10, increased our production of all kinds of product by using energy. So it was a significant productivity jump. Well, as we moved forward, we used oil and gas, nuclear and other things, and so the energy density continued to increase. Today, the energy density is orders of magnitude what it was 200 years ago. That's good for humanity. That has allowed us to enjoy the fruits of energy. And we will continue to improve the energy density that we so much enjoy in today's modern economy. Now, what also came as a result of that, though, was environmental destruction, release of carbon, because those original years was based on hydrocarbons. And when you combust hydrocarbon, you release CO2. In addition, you release all kinds of other kind of environmental issues, both land, water, and air. So this concept of trying to reduce our emissions is not just based on CO2. We hear a lot about that. We got to reduce the carbon, but it's a variety of other things. It's about taking care of our planet. It's about trying to figure out how we can reduce the impact of energy from a broad perspective to help all of us live a better and more fruitful and healthier life. So we are now in the midst of this next major energy transition where we're trying to work our way out of using fossil fuels. Now you hear people, oh, well, we're going to be off of fossil fuel by, pick a date, 2030. That's not even remotely possible. Okay, how about 2050? That's not even remotely possible. I mean, there are a lot of benefits to using hydrocarbons. Pretty much everything that we own uses hydrocarbons in making plastic or a variety of other devices that we use. And that is the basis of a lot of what we're going to have to take advantage of as we go through this energy transition. So we're not going to just automatically turn the spigot off. Now, do we have to reduce our carbon footprint? Do we have to reduce the amount of water that we use? Do we have to reduce the amount of other pollutants? Absolutely. But we have to do it in a way that is humanely acceptable to every person on this planet. So I'm all for trying to move forward as fast as we can, but I'm also a realist, a pragmatist, and I think about if we do this wrong, we're going to suffer the consequences that are going to be significant for years to come, if not decades. These energy transitions take a long time. It can take 100 years. This just doesn't happen overnight. And it's messy, and it's a very, very expensive to do. And so the question is, how can we do this that builds on top of technology in a way that every person on this planet can benefit from the energy resources that we so dearly loved? This morning, we heard a comment. 1 billion people do not have access to electricity, much less reliable electricity. That's profound. We live in this world today, and we still have, if there's, 8 billion people on this planet? 1 billion plus does not have reliable electricity? And that's crazy. With all the technology that we enjoy today, and that's still a fact. Well, how do we bring those people along with us? It doesn't happen overnight. There's a lot of training. There's a lot of adapting to the social cultures in those communities that are trying to be enriched like we are. They want to be. A few years ago, I was in a village that just received electricity in Africa. The village was something like 400 years old, and they just got electricity. And I was there, and I asked them, I said, why? Why do you want electricity? They said 3 things. 1, to run the motors to pump water out of the ground. 2, to be able to communicate with the outside world. That's part of being, an opportunity to be educated. Happening. And 3, what do you think the third one was? This one kind of really surprised me. Anybody want to guess?
Watching football matches.
Watching football matches, yeah. Refrigeration. Yeah. For medicines and so on. That is where I grew up. I thought that was a basic right. Right? That's the society we live in, but that's not the case. And so we have a social obligation to help the world manage and move forward with this energy transition. That's about as blunt as I can say it. We have an obligation. Now, there's a lot of things that come with that obligation. One is we have to understand what are the technical and also the social implications to enable this transition. I know that there was discussion this morning about that. We have to be able to understand the issues around the circular economy. There was a discussion this morning around AI. Let me just give you one number on AI. So how many of you have used GPT-3? How many of you? All right. So that's just kind of the latest, right? How much did it cost in terms of energy to train that AI? How much was it? Put it in terms of how much energy the average American uses in their home in 1 year. Put it in terms of that. Anybody want to guess? The amount of energy that it took to train that AI was the equivalent of 138 1.8 U.S. homes, amount of energy they use for 1 year. Average U.S. home, 138 of them, for 1 year was the amount of energy it took to train ChatGPT-3 that took 14 days. That's profound. And I can guarantee you ChatGPT-3 is not going to be the last. There will be multiple AI algorithms that get developed that'll be trained on multiple different data sets out there. And this venture in AI is just starting. I did my dissertation in AI back in the early 90s when it was just something that people, a few geeks were talking about. Now, it's going to be used on it for everything. Some good, some bad. The amount of energy that we're going to use in electrifying our global economy is going to be orders of magnitude more than what I think we even imagine.
So, Mike, if I can follow up on that, there were several visions of elements of the transition in energy expressed this morning on the national level, the global level, regional level. What is your sort of short-term vision for this coming energy transition, and then maybe a longer-term vision as well? So now to 2050 and then beyond 2050.
Yeah. So I kind of break it into two temporal zones, one to 2030, which, by the way, is not that far away. And then we go to 2050. So when we think about going to 2030, there are a few things that I think are critically important. One is that we continue to advance all of the above technologies. So I'm a technologist advocate. I think we should not take anything off the table, but advance and spend a significant amount of research in trying to advance those technologies and make many of them available to other countries to be able to use. Doesn't make any difference if we hoard it here. Meanwhile, we're using coal plants to produce steam and electricity somewhere else. That's not helping the humanity. So between now and 2030, I think there are a few things that one, we need to move aggressively to make sure that as many people in the world have access to reliable electricity as possible. I mean, that's kind of like step one. That we can do by 2030. We've made significant strides over the last 10 years. I remember when it was close to 2 billion people without electricity. Now we're actually, the latest numbers I saw were down below 1 billion people now, so I don't know, give or take a little probably. So that's one. Two is a recognition that we need to continue to use fossil fuels. Now, for many cases, I think moving to natural gas is the next step in that evolution. Moving off of coal and moving to natural gas, I think, is a very legitimate next step. And there's still a lot of coal that's used throughout this world. Also, starting to think about how do we convert a lot of those hydrocarbon intense industries to electricity. Now, that may sound simple, okay? We just kind of plug it in and now all of a sudden we can use electricity. But it is much more difficult than it sounds. Let's take cement. 6% of the CO2 emissions comes from the processing and making of Portland cement. 6% globally. We use a lot of concrete. We use a lot of steel. The process to convert that heating from fossil fuels to using electricity is an extremely complex process. There are some experimental technologies that companies are using now, but we're a long ways from solving this problem. But between now and 2030, we have to make significant strides on moving forward with using electricity to electrify many, many of our in-use devices. Now, it may be still in small scale by 2030, but steel and cement and other things. If we could make major strides on that, that is a huge step. Electric transportation is the other one. There are a lot of things that we can do to electrify transportation. One of them is batteries. By the way, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for the lithium-ion battery just passed away, I think maybe yesterday or the day before. Anybody know his name? Good enough. He went to Oxford. I mean, that was in 1990, I think, was when he developed it. That was a significant step toward electrification. Now, that enabled us to move off of lead-acid batteries. Can you imagine driving around with lead-acid batteries now? By the way, Ford and GM were developing electric vehicles using lead-acid batteries in the early part of the last century. So, but question: lithium-ion batteries. What is the number one technology that is being advanced right now to on lithium-ion batteries to enable electric transportation? It has to do with increasing, and I used this word earlier, energy density. Now, what that means, let's take your average Tesla. It has batteries that will go about 300 miles. The 300 miles is dictated by the energy density of the lithium-ion battery. We are increasing the energy density about 18% every 2 years. So we're able to get 18% more energy in a given size, about 18% more every 2 years. That's exactly why we're able to do 300 miles, the same size, 400 miles, eventually it'll be 800 miles. I would say we're probably 5 years away from being 700 miles on a full charge. I don't know about you guys, but I can't drive 700 miles in a day, so I'm not, that kind of reaches my peak. I'll charge overnight. But that energy density is what is also going to enable all kinds of other electric vehicle transportation, trucks and so on. So then I come back to wondering about hydrogen. Is hydrogen really an option when it comes to electric transportation, long term? Maybe we'll come back to that one.
Okay.
So these are the types of technologies that are so important to advance. The other thing, and we talked about a little bit of this morning, is that if we think about electrifying, we also have to think about the delivery of the electricity. And we think about delivery of the electricity, we have to think about transmission and distribution. Now, we are significantly short of transmission on this planet. We have a lot of work to do on that if we are going to move forward with electricity. Now, question. How much of our total energy globally that we're using today is electricity? So if you think about the total energy that we use, how much of it is electricity? Anyone guess? Well, huh? Yeah, it's right around 20%. Yep, that's right. 20%. What's the rest? Biomass, oil, gas, hydrocarbons, and so on. That's pretty much. I mean, coal, that's right. Yeah, that's the rest of it. So there have been a lot of studies that have looked at where will we be in 2050 in terms of our use of electricity in terms of the overall percent of energy. Now, there have been a lot of different studies. I'm sure BP has one, and IEA, and many, many other people. Some of the numbers that when you triangulate and kind of take the average, I come up with about 50% as the likely percent of electricity in terms of overall energy by 2050. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're all going to be using more electricity. Why more electricity? Well, we're going to be using it for AI. We're going to be using it for electric transportation. We're going to be using it because the planet's warming for a lot of air conditioning. And so electricity gives us a lot more energy options than do hydrocarbons. Now, we're going to be using hydrocarbons to produce electricity, and that's where potentially carbon capture and storage comes in. But we're also going to be using a lot more wind and solar and renewable energy. A lot more batteries. Okay.
You've given us a bit of your vision going forward 20, 25 years. Maybe an even more basic question, what are the goals that we should be shooting for? I mean, Sultan Al-Jaber has already said at COP28 they're going to focus on keeping a goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade as a ceiling on on climate change. Does it need to be decarbonization? Is this a focus on CCUS? Is this a focus on replacing fossil fuels? But what goals do you think are realistic and something that can be financed and distributed equally as you say?
Yeah, so it seems like that we talk a lot about 1.5 degrees C. It's great to have that goal, but we're almost there. In fact, we're latest information I saw from the World Meteorological Organization is we're close to 1.2. We already have kind of baked into the system 1.5. I think there's an opportunity here to say, okay, we still do everything we can to strive toward policies, financing, technologies to get to the 1.5. But realistically, we're going to go beyond that. And so what does that also mean? If we don't start thinking about adaptation, we're going to be in a world of mess. And so while we continue to focus on the technologies and the financing and the thinking about reducing carbon, we also need to think about how do we adapt to this new world. And there are many, many things that we could do for that. I'll just give you one example. There was in Houston, the flooding that was maybe, I can't remember now, a couple of years ago. Yeah. One of the things that they found out is that the substations where all the big wires come in together got flooded. Well, part of the adaptation is raising that up a few feet. I mean, there are a lot of things that we need to think about to adapt to a more extreme climate event situation. And we need to start now. We can't wait till it happens.
I'm going to ask you one last question and then open up the floor for discussion. You approached at the very beginning of this conversation the sort of protection of the climate and the energy transition as a moral issue, one where we have to bring people, countries less fortunate than the United States, Europe, or the Gulf along with us. how can that be accomplished? I see hundreds of billions of dollars of energy flowing into renewables and CCUS and new technologies in the United States, especially with the Inflation Reduction Act. We now hear about European parliaments collectively or individually putting similar ideas that will bring keep European capital in Europe and not have to go to the US. And the whole goal is to create profitable companies, to create jobs and prosperity in the United States, in Europe, potentially in industrialized Asia as well. How will mitigation and adaptation be financed in the global South, in Africa, in less affluent countries in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America? And whose responsibility is to help define this?
Yeah. So I'm sure there will be economists and political scientists that may disagree with this, but I think it is the developed countries' obligation to certainly reach out and help a lot more than is occurring right now. And also recognizing that as we go through this energy transition, there will be multiple shapes and colors and speed of transition that countries go through. It's not one for all. What happens in Africa has to be done based on the culture, the history, the resources, the technical expertise that they have, and so on. And how they adapt is going to be different than what we do here, for example. And we have to understand that. And we have to reach out and try to help. We have to be willing to take some of these unique technologies that we're developing and let them use the technology to continue to advance. But taking a nuclear plant and say, we're going to put it right in the middle of Africa, who has no nuclear engineering program, is ludicrous. And if we think that we can go do it for them, that's not sustainable. We have to help them develop the infrastructure that takes this so they can do it on their own over time. I'm pretty passionate about that. We have to work with these communities one at a time to help bring them up and take advantage of the energy resources that we so dearly love. And it's going to be different. Some of it is going to be based on using microgrids, not central station generation that we enjoy here. It's going to be based on batteries and wind and solar and other technologies. It's all going to be different. And it's going to take financing. We have to be able to help. So I saw a number the other day. 60% of the developing countries are debt, they call it debt, And they have that burden that they're trying to work themselves out of. And how can we expect them to move at the pace that we expect the world to? They can't. We have to help. The developed world has got to help.
All right, let's open up the floor for questions. We'll start right here. There we go.
Majid Zidane, University of Maine. So let's say a developing country want to build a new capacity for electricity for both residential and industrial. Nowadays in 2023, if they don't want to go nuclear, what are the options, the feasible options that could work both for residential and industrial, in your opinion?
So you have, did everyone hear the question? So a new community wants to move forward with electricity. What are their options? You certainly have like gas turbines. You know, if they have access to gas. You have wind and solar, probably the cheapest option. Right now, it's quickly becoming the cheapest option, backed by batteries. Nuclear is certainly something that's more reserved for more advanced economies, and it's also expensive, but it comes with a lot of other benefits as well. So I would think right now probably the highest on the list would be using wind and solar with batteries backed up by some base load generation like gas turbines or maybe some biomass, depending on how much wood and other plant-based materials that they have. So they could use biomass as well. Or they could also, depending on their availability of water, could use hydro. So it's probably a mixture of a lot of things, not just one single thing. It's probably the answer. This particular place in Africa that I went to was solar with batteries. Yeah.
Well, let me follow up on that, because not only what do you use to generate the electricity, but what is the scale of what you have to generate? Is it a village? Is it a city? Is it a province? How do you, is it an area, a population number? And I'm sure it's different in different places, but how do you figure out the best mix of source of electricity to the population or industries that need to be served by that electricity?
Yeah. So you look at what the potential load and the timing of the load, more morning, more afternoon, or whatever. And so you look at that, and then you back in the design, solar, wind, gas, biomass, and so on. So you back into it. And then the other thing is all of it has to work together. The one thing about electricity that a lot of people don't quite, especially in the oil and gas industry, is that in electricity, things happen on a sub-second basis because you have to balance the amount of generation with the load, and they have to be balanced. And if not, it just kind of falls apart. So that is one of the physical requirements of electricity, is being able to balance the amount of generation of electricity with the load. And so that itself creates another problem, but that's where we're headed.
All right. No, please go ahead.
Thank you. You just raised an interesting point in balancing the generation with the load. Is there a way that you can sort of compensate for that differential using the battery?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's so in the U.S., more fully electrified kind of Europe, the U.S., Japan, I mean some others, you compensate for that balancing through interconnection. So transmission lines and others that get connected. And so while you need more over here, you move it over there, through the wires. But more and more of the thinking is also to use batteries as a resource to help make sure that they're equal, the balance is there. So more of it is batteries.
You started to touch on a point when you mentioned the term use of a microgrid.
Yeah.
I, in theory, had wondered, could you have a community, let's call it a village, a borough, a neighborhood that was totally energy self-reliant, meaning through wind, solar, geothermal? Mm-hmm. Could you basically provide all of the electrical needs in an ideal world, even, sell some of that energy back to the grid, or sort of in a co-op arrangement, swap it for other utilities, right? Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I was told, I'm from Pennsylvania, one of the issues is the grid. Mm-hmm. What is allowed back and under what terms, usually I think it's for credit as to future usage, but and not being able to do it sort of en banc, but it had to be done unit by unit, or residential unit by unit. I can only do it for my house. I couldn't do it as like the city of, Teslaville.
Yeah. Yeah. So the idea is that this wires that are connected, he could be generating electricity and selling it back to the grid for me to use. I could be 100 miles away, let's say, or I could be his next door neighbor, and we could trade back and forth. And that could help balance our overall need for electricity. Now, in the U.S., this gets down to more policy issues. There are certain restrictions at the local level that he can put it back on the grid and everybody could use it. But once you start, if we have this agreement with some other neighbors, then we become a utility, and that creates other issues. So from a technical perspective, you're absolutely true. In fact, many of the developing countries that are trying to expand their energy resources are looking at these types of configurations. Using a microgrid as just a small standalone system. It could be in a neighborhood, a community, or even broader. Or you could have multiple grids kind of connected together and they feed off of each other. So those are some of the ways that I think many of the developing countries will get access to electricity. It's through these smaller regional connection hubs with connections in between. So it's really a network problem.
Thank you.
Anybody on this side? Robert Ogilnecki.
Okay, thank you. A couple of years ago, Oman sold a 49% stake in its state-owned electricity company to a Chinese firm. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, given your background in electricity, about the geopolitical implications of foreign investments in a given country's, electricity firm, state-owned electricity firm, or grid. Thank you.
So, a very good question. A lot of it depends on, I think, you have to think about the security issue. And it's one thing to own it, it's another thing to control it. And so if you control the operation of the grid, that gives you more security. If you pass the operation of the grid to someone else, then you could be vulnerable. But there are many other foreign companies that are owning different transmission assets. For example, not too long ago, there was a company in the U.S. that owned a transmission asset in the U.K. I mean, that happens. Nothing wrong with that. But it really comes down to what are you giving up in terms of potential security for the benefit of ownership. So I think that's the real issue you have to look at. And then the other thing is, by passing that to someone else, are you enabling the expertise to develop within your own country? Just some of these are, energy is something that's going to be around for a long time. And there's a certain amount of capability that you need to develop within your own country. The educational system. We haven't talked about the workforce development yet, but you need to develop that workforce and that capability, the educational system, the university infrastructure, and so on. You have to develop that. The regulatory issues. How do you regulate? Somebody brought that up this morning. You need to help develop these things so that eventually you're more sustainable in terms of your own energy security.
Well, in fact, I think the education at all levels is going to be a key part of adaptation, because you have to, at the elementary school level, teach children how to live more efficiently, and at the university level, teach people how to produce new and ever more sophisticated ways to transmit and produce electricity.
Yeah. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned the word efficiency. I am a big advocate for, when you think about using electricity, start off first by thinking more efficient. There is a lot of things that we could do to be more efficient in how we use electricity. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit.
So go back to this side. Anyone here? Okay. Sir, please.
Given the principal characteristic of small modular reactors as energy dense, do you think there's a role for SMRs to play in developing countries and shaping their energy future?
Yeah, a lot more so a small modular reactor. than a large, 1,000 megawatt light water reactor. Because part of the smaller modular reactor is designed as being a system that you can put in place and then you just kind of let it run. But I say that only if the country agrees to certain things. And one is that they agree to develop the social structure to support it. Now, a country that says, I'm going to put in a small modular reactor, and they have no, for example, nuclear engineering program, I'd say no. You have to educate the workforce to be able to support it. Or else I would say, don't go there. But I do think there is an important role for small modular reactors. It's post-2030, maybe closer to 2050. But I do think, and I am very pro-nuclear, and so I do think there's an important role for that. In fact, a lot of times I'll talk about end-to-end, which N, the letter N, natural gas to nuclear. That may be a little extreme for some people, but I do think there is a role for nuclear, and the prices have got to significantly come down, and on and on and on. But there's a lot of work in that area right now.
So we'll come here to the middle to Tim Callan next. Tim.
Thank you. So big picture question. I guess two big trends, as you said, of financing and technological transfer, yet we're in an environment where, certainly the trade side, the relations across different regions of the world are deteriorating. And as you mentioned, governments, not just in developing countries, but in many advanced countries, are getting to debt levels which are, probably in many cases difficult to sustain. So I guess, how does this work out in terms of, getting an energy transition in, 50 years when you have an environment that doesn't seem conducive to two of the major things you're going to need? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is the whole trade issue. It's my toy, and I'm going to keep it to myself. That is a real restriction globally. I realize the issue around intellectual property and so on, but maybe there's a way that I worked on this one. It was actually a CCS project, and there was some really intellectual property. We kind of separated that in a black box, but then enabled everything else around it. So there are ways that we can do that, or ways that we've done that on semiconductors over the years. And so I think when someone just says, we're not going to trade with you, no, we got to change that mentality. There are restrictions that we could have, but we got to be willing to help these countries, because this is a global issue, not a local issue. Climate changes, and we have to treat it as much more global than we are. So that issue is one that concerns me. Also, same thing with financing.
But let me go back to something that you said very early on. I appreciated the idea that countries that have technology and wealth have responsibilities for an energy transition. I want to slice that differently. What do you see as the chief responsibilities of governments as versus private sector organizations? Because I think there are strengths and weaknesses of each. So how do you think they should be integrated in a transition?
So I think governments need to think about what are they prohibiting in terms of the transition? What roadblocks are they creating that inadvertently don't allow the energy transition? Whether it's financing, whether it's regulatory, whether it's political, social restrictions that they place. I mean, it's looking at that and then let the market take. If you take care of that, the market will figure out a way, I think, to enable it. But there are a lot of countries that I've been to that there are restrictions, and like, okay, well, fine, that we can't go there. So those restrictions, I think, is the one thing that I would encourage take a serious look at.
Look over on this side of the room. Any questions? Please.
This morning there was a brief reference, excuse me, to desalinization, particularly in the Gulf. I'm wondering if you could maybe develop a bit further this connection between water security and power generation, and how particularly countries in the Gulf can reduce that vulnerability they have to being so dependent on a single technology.
Yeah. So water restriction is becoming a major problem, not only just in the U.S., but around the world. And it's something that is going to become even a more serious issue. So in terms of developing the technology, when I was at EPRI, I constantly emphasized anything that you develop, when you're in part of that development cycle, think about how socially it will be used. Think about the unintended consequences. Think about the amount of water that's used to enable that technology to be successful. A fossil plant uses a tremendous amount of water. Now, South Africa has figured this out, so they have what they call dry cooling. I mean, there are various technologies that you can implement to help reduce the amount of water that is used. And so we have to think through that. But there are many things, especially in more thermal plants where water is front and center. But can we also use brackish water, which is I don't know how to explain it. It's not always clean water. It's water that can be filtrated and reused over and over and over. There's a whole body of research that's going on right now to reuse water that we have and really think about our overall use of water. We're going to hear a lot more about water, and we've already started here, especially in the Middle East.
And actually, let me add to that, because I was in the Gulf last week, and sort of two issues on water and energy relationships I found were very interesting. One is one of the countries I visited has got a real bifurcation in their energy. They've got a ministry of oil, and then they have a ministry of electricity, water, and renewable energy. So they have chosen to put renewable energy bureaucratically with electricity production, because every power plant has a desalinization plant along with it. This is one way to organize it. Does it make sense in the long run if the country is getting most of its revenue through oil? And then how is that revenue is efficiently allocated back into the production of electricity or renewables? The other was an NGO I met with that has its project to try to take the condensation from air conditioning, which is now 95 or 97% lost. What would it cost? They're trying to figure out, if you hook up apartment buildings, office buildings, parking lots, shopping malls, how can you reuse the water from the condensation from air conditioning? Totally two different scales, but people are beginning to look at the efficiency of water usage and what the most bureaucratically efficient way to link energy, electricity, water together. I'm not sure anybody's got the right answer yet, but I've had just two interesting approaches last week.
Yep.
Other questions over here? On this side? No? Right here. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, you touched a little bit on this earlier, but I kind of wanted to ask a follow-up question. So I appreciate that there is a slow timeline for the energy transition. It makes more sense for the economy, for the people involved, but kind of with the rapid pace of climate change, and for a lot of people and nations, it really is life or death. Do we not have a responsibility to kind of speed up the timeline in becoming more sustainable? And is it more affordable to even do that, as you can see, like with ocean levels rising and things like that?
Yeah. So I thank you for asking that question. We have to, it's paramount, have a sense of urgency, but recognize that things happen on a scale that can be absorbed. That products can be made, people can be educated, communities can adopt it, and so on. There's this built-in mechanism to be able to adapt and move forward with the energy transition in a pace that I think has to be recognized, that is not easy. It's in every community, every country has their own pace, but we need to do that thinking that time is of the essence. So we got to push, and we can't just let it happen. And so we have to push. And I do feel there is a sense of urgency and need to move as fast as we can. But I just think that at the same time, thinking that we're going to get to 1.5 is just almost misleading as well. So that's the balance. So I do feel a sense of urgency. So we have grandkids, and I don't want them to live in an environment that's 2.0.
So we'll go back over to this side. Any more questions here?
But keep asking that question. Don't give up on that one.
Please.
Hi, Michael Check-Kim with State Department. So one thing that is to this conference, and thank you for hosting this, ran through my head like the relationship between disasters and energy. Now, I would say war is a bad word, and hopefully I dream for the day there's no more war. But I did help when we had to get our Americans out of Sudan just recently, and Yemen is in constant problem. Although we're in a good spot right now, but there's also natural disasters, and you touched on one thing: flooding, even in the United States. So. Is the energy sector, our energy companies kind of, how do they see disasters as an area that they can plan for in terms of servicing the needs of people, of societies?
Yeah. So the one thing that's happened over the last 10 years is the recognition that the climate change is creating more weather events. That connection between anthropogenic CO2 and climate, I think, is something that has been studied significantly, and there is a connection there. And it's becoming even more extreme. So companies now, even utility companies, are starting to think, if we're going to provide the reliability and the resiliency of energy that society expects, we have to think differently about the operation of the grid. What are things that we can do? We can increase the elevation of our substations. We can reinforce the transmission lines. We can, in fact, now even when being able to predict weather events and stationing recovery crews in and around those locations. So there's a whole variety of things that are happening now that to really deal with this issue. Unfortunately, it's only going to get worse. My gosh, we've had more heat waves now, both in the U.S. and in Europe and Asia, than we've ever had. Unfortunately, now part of that is due to El Nino this year, but a lot of it is just the changing temperature. We're going to have more of these. Yeah.
Well, actually, Doug, before you ask your question, let me add on top of that, but a different kind of energy-related disaster. Because 2 years ago, we had a Gulf energy minister speak at our conference, and he very seriously criticized hydrogen as an energy source stored in ammonia, saying that ammonia is dangerous to humans and life, and if you start transporting ammonia as a source of energy around the world, there will be a large-scale disaster. People will die, and you will be either you'll just have to live with it, or you will have a lot of social pressure to end that. One of the questions is, as we go through, how do you mitigate, reduce the chance of whatever kind of disaster that may be associated with the old energy system or the developing energy systems, and you have to look. Having a new system for the future may not be the only way. In other words, it may solve old problems and create new problems, but we'll look at this going forward. And Doug, I'll let you ask your question, please.
Yeah. Sorry. One issue I don't think we've discussed yet is cyber security. So a more electrified world could increase the cybersecurity risks. Who is responsible for dealing with that? Is it the utilities? Is it governments? Is it somebody else?
So it's both. And let me tell you, I used to serve on the ESCC, which is a joint government industry cyber program in the U.S. Cyber is an issue that is also not going away. We are going to be more digitized as we more electrify. And so we have to think about everything that we do. What is the potential vulnerability? And that really is a partnership between the government and the industry. And we have, there are a lot of things that we could do to reduce the probability or likelihood of a cyber event. One is just keep your devices up to date on the, on the updates, the software updates. But it is a major issue, but it is a joint effort between the two. It has to be. I don't see any way around that one.
I think, well, let's see. We've got two questions. We'll go here first. Sarah, you'll be the last question.
And I want to hit hydrogen too before, because I got some ideas on that one.
Maybe we'll, okay, please.
Thank you so much for your insight today. My name is Elizabeth Score, and piggybacking off of the cybersecurity question, as we continue to develop critical infrastructure in these developing nations, bringing them onto the power grid, and opening them up to these vulnerabilities, how can we ensure that those that are responsible for electrifying those communities, when we go in, start strong and not leave them with, all of the zero-day vulnerabilities that power companies in the United States are vulnerable to today? Because it's unrealistic to think that we're just going to automatically catapult them into 2023.
Yeah, no, it's society is going to be more vulnerable. And when we deploy some technology, we really have to make sure that local governments, communities are cyber aware. This is a big issue. EPRI has a program on cyber, and it's just there's no one set formula. But I think right now, just an awareness that it's a serious issue and plan for it is an important part. So we could spend a whole hour on that one, and maybe the next time.
Okay, Sarah.
Thank you very much for the very insightful and interesting presentation. I just have a question, very quick one. You talked about energy intensity. In your opinion, if just aside from carbon emissions, which fuel do you think is the most efficient or best fuel to produce electricity if you wanted to look at?
Nuclear by far.
Nuclear.
So the efficiency and energy intensity of nuclear is orders of magnitude greater than anything else. So that one's, yeah.
Okay. Kate, please.
And then I want to hit hydrogen.
Okay, then you do hydrogen.
Very quickly. Nobody's kicking us out yet. I wanted to ask, climate change is also having an impact on the on solar, the ability of solar to cope with increased dust storms, the efficiency. And also the UN tells us the wind speeds are going to come down. So what is being done? I mean, obviously the technology has to keep adapting to the changing weather patterns.
Yeah. So a lot of work on designing of wind turbines to extract as much energy as it can from the movement of air. And so they're becoming more efficient. Let me give you a specific example on solar panels. The average solar panel efficiency was somewhere around 12% just about maybe 15 years ago. Now we're up toward 18%. There are technologies that are now reaching up to even 30%. And so what's happening is the efficiency, in other words, the ability of the solar panel design to convert photons, light, into electricity is considerably improving over time, and it will. So now we're in fact, the latest I saw was 48%. That's experimental, but that's one thing. So while you have the climate change issue, you're able to convert more of what photons do get through into electricity. So hydrogen, and I'll make it really quick.
Well, and I've got one last question that I want to actually lay out. No, but after you finish hydrogen, but lay out for everybody in the room as well to think about. So, Mike, hydrogen.
So hydrogen is an area that I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about, and my conclusion right now, I can change, is that if you can absolutely not electrify, then consider hydrogen, but as only a last resort. And maybe the next time we can talk a lot more about that, but the thought of shipping ammonia around the world as a resource, maybe there's some applications that you need it, but I would think about that as a last resort, first electrify. That's kind of what I'm thinking right now. Now, using hydrogen at the end result where you can use an electrolysis to convert water to hydrogen to use at the point of end use, maybe. But the problem with hydrogen is that H and O love each other way too much. And it takes a lot of energy to extract the two. But there's some new catalysts that are being developed that will lower that energy, but there's still a physical limitation on that. And I just don't think, I think somebody said it earlier, it is way overhyped right now. And there's a certain amount of realism that has to come into the picture. So that's my comment. Okay.
Last question, but this is really for everybody in the room to leave thinking about, and maybe you can come back tomorrow and contribute sort of online the answers. We've talked a lot about international responsibility, need for cooperation, how the global north can help the global south. Is the whole conference of parties, COP27, COP28, recently focused on the Middle East, worthwhile? Is this a waste of resources, or is it something that focuses energy? And if it is worthwhile, what part of it is the most worthwhile?
So
and it's an easy
there's
question,
what I love are these types of dialogue. I like the give and the take. I like the discussion because it's just elevating the issues forward. When I've been to COP, I did not get a lot out of them in the previous ones. For me, the discussions seem to be hollow or over-optimistic or pie in the sky kind of thing. I don't know. But it's these types of forums where you can get down into the dirt and really have these robust discussions. That's what I like. Now, a big part of COP, though, is also one-on-one sidebar discussions. It's you and I coming together and talking about a deal. And a lot of work happens in the back room. So from that perspective, it's useful. But in terms of broad policy issues, I think it's less effective. That's my view.
Okay. If you'll all join me for thanking Mike Howard for an amazing, more than an hour-long presentation. Mike, thank you very much for joining us.